Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again, to Reading Thucydides Peloponnesian War. We're using the landmark Thucydides, the Crawley translation, and with the edition we see here is the Google Books version of it, with its kind of imperfections we talked about earlier in the videos. Uh, Today we are doing the summer of the 18th year, um, or the winter of the 17th year. Sorry, I apologize. Winter of the 17th year. We finished the second part two of the summer dealing with the events about the Sicilian operation, and the calling. We ended it with the calling back of the Athenians, calling back, recalling Alcibiades for suspicious activities or overthrowing plots regarding the destructions of the Hermes and other mysteries, and that the enemies of Alcibiades were using this as getting rid of him, and he and coming back, knowing how other people have been put to death and things like this, fearing this, he instead of going back, he fled, and once fled, his property was seized and things like this, and he was condemned to death. Uh, um, now we start now with the winter of the 17th year, um, the 17th year, following chapter 20, chapter 63. Summer was now over. The winter following, the Athenians at once began to prepare to move on Syracuse, and the Syracuse on their side for marching against them. From the moment when the Athenians failed to attack them instantly, as they first feared and expected, every day that passed something did to revise their courage. When they saw them sailing far away from them on the other side of Sicily and going to Hebria, only to fail in their attempt to storm it, they thought less of them than ever, and called upon their generals, as the multitude was apt to do in a moment of confidence, to lend them to lead them to Canta, since the enemy would not come to them. The parties also of the Syracusan horse employed in reconnoiter constantly rode up to Athenians' armaments, and among other insults asked them whether they had not really come to settle alongside the Syracusans in a foreign country than to resettle the Leontanes in um, um, their own. Aware of this, Athenian generals determined to draw them out in mass as far as possible from the city, and themselves, in the meantime, to sail at night along shore and take up their leisure in convenient positions. This they knew they could do not so well if they had disembarked from their ships in front of a force prepared for them, and to go by land to go by land openly. The numerous cavalry of the Syracusan, a force which they are themselves without, would then be able to do the greatest harm to their light troops, and that the crowd that followed them. But this plan would enable them to take up a position in which the horse could do them no hurt worth speaking of. Some Syracuse exiles, with an army of having told them of the spot where Olympium, which they afterwards occupied. In pursuance of their idea, the generals devised the following stratagem. They sent to Syracuse a man devoted to them, and by the Syracuse in general thought to be no less in their interest. He was a native of Catana, and he came from persons in that place whom names the Syracusan generals were acquainted with, and they knew to be among the members of the party still left in the city. He told them that the Athenians passed the night in the city at some distance of their arms, and that the Syracusans would name a day and come with all their people at daylight to attack the armaments. They, their friends, would close the gates upon the troops in the city and set to the vessels, while the Syracusans could easily take the camp in an attack upon the stockade. In this, they would be aided as many Cantanians who were already prepared to act, from whom he himself came. The general of the Syracusan, who did not lack confidence, and intended every who had intended every even without this information to march on Canada, believed the man without any sufficient inquiry, fixed it on the day upon which they would arrive, and dismissed him. And the Simulutes and others of their allies having now arrived, gave them orders for all the Syracusans to march out in full force. Their preparation completed, and the time fixed for their arrival being at hand, they all set out for Cantina, passing the night upon the river Thucydides and the Leontine territories. Meanwhile, the Athenians no sooner knew of their approach than took all their forces, and as such of the Sicilians, on the other hand, joined them, put them on board their ships and boats, and sailed by night to Syracuse. Thus, when morning broke, the Athenians were landing opposite of the Olympium, or ready to seize the camping ground. And the Syracusans, having horse ridden up to Cantina, found that all the armaments had been put to sea, wheeled back and told the infantry, and had all turned back together and went to relieve the city. In the meanwhile, as the march before the Syracusans was a long one, the Athenians quietly established their army in a convenient position where they could begin their engagement when they pleased, and where the Syracusan cavalry would have the least opportunity of harassing them, either before or during the action, being flanked on each side of its walls, houses, trees, and by its marsh, and the other by cliffs. They also felled the neighboring trees and carried them down to the seas, and formed the palisade alongside their ships, and with stones which they picked up, and wood. Lastly, raised a fort at Dacasson, the most vulnerable point of their position, and broke down the bridge over the Antrobus, whose preparations were allowed to go without any interruption from the city. The first hostile force appeared, being the Syracusan cavalry, followed afterwards with all their infantry altogether. They marched close up to the Athenian army, and then, finding that they did not offer to engage, crossed the Hellenian road and camped for the night. The next day, the Athenians and their allies prepared for battle, their dispositions being as follows: the right wing was occupied by the Argives and the Mantinees, the center by the Athenians, and the rest of the field by their allies. Half their army was drawn up 8 deep in the advance, half of their tents close to a hollow square, formed in 8 deep, and had orders to look out to be ready to go to support of the troops hard pressed. The camp followers were placed inside this reserve, and the Syracusans meanwhile formed their own hoplite 16 deep, consisting of mass levies of their own people, and such allies had joined them, and strongest contingent being that of the Silenese. Next to them, the cavalry of the Leonones, numbering 200 at all, with about 20 horse and 50 archers from Camarina. The cavalry, filled a full 1,200 strong, was posed on their right next to the darters. And the Athenians were about to begin attack when Nicias went along the lines and addressed them with this word of encouragement, and the nations composed to the army, and the nations composed. Soldiers, a long exhaustion is needed by men like ourselves, who are here to fight in the same battle, with forces being, to my thinking, more fit to inspire confidence than a fine speech with a weak army. Here we have the Argives, Mantinees, Athenians, the first of all the islanders, and the rank together. It were strange indeed, with so many and so brave companion in arms, if we did not feel confident of victory. Nevertheless, when we mass levies opposed to our picked troops, and what is more, Sicilians who may disdain us, will not stand against us, their skill not being all commensurate with their rashness. You may also remember that we are far from home and have no friendly land here, except what your own swords shall win you. And he, and here I put before you a motive just the reverse of what which the enemy are appealing. Their cry being that they are fighting for their country. Mine is that we shall fight for a country that is not ours, where we must conquer or hardly get away, as we have shall have their horse upon us in great numbers. Remember your renown. Do not go and go boldly against the enemy, thinking the present difficulty and insistently more terrible than they. After this, Nicias' address at once led on the army, and the Syracusans were not at that moment expecting an immediate engagement, and some had even gone away to the city, which was close by. Now, these ran up as fast as they could, and though late, took their places here and there in the main body, and joined. And as they joined in it, lack of zeal or daring was certain not the fault of the Syracusans, either in this or other battles. But although not inferior in courage as long as the military science proved adequate, when this failed them, they were compelled to give up their resolution also. Also, on the present occasion, although they had not supposed that the Athenians would begin the attack, and although constrained to stand up their defense at short notice, they at once took up their arms and advanced to meet. First, stone throwers, slingers, and archers of either army began skirmishing and routed or were routed by one another, as might expected between light troops. Next, soothsayers brought forward the usual victims. The trumpeter urged on the hoplites to charge, and thus they advanced, the Syracusan, to fight for their country, and each individual for the safety that day and liberty hereafter. And the enemy's army, the Athenians, sought to make another country theirs, and to save their own from suffering by their defeat. And the Argives, the allies, aimed to help them in getting what they came for, and to earn by victory another site of the country they had left behind, while the subject allies owed much more of their ardor to the desire of self-preservation, which they could only hope for victorious, and if a secondary motive for the chances of serving on easier terms after helping the Athenians to a fresh conquest. The armies now came to close quarters, and for a long while fought without having gaining ground. Meanwhile, there occurred some claps of thunder with lightning and heavy rain, which did not fail to add to the fears of the party fighting for the first time, and with little acquainted with war, while they were more experienced adversaries. These phenomena appeared to produce, by the time of year, much more alarm than felt with the continued resistance of the enemy. At last, the Argives drove in the Syracusan left, and after them the Athenians routed the troops opposed them, and the Syracusan army was thus cut in two and betook itself to flight. Athenians did not pursue far, being held in check by numerous undefeated Syracusan horse who attacked and drove back any of their hoplites who they saw pursuing in advance of the rest, in spite of which the victors followed as far as was safe in a body and went back and set up a trophy. Meanwhile, the Syracusan rallied at the Hairline Road, where they reformed as well as they could under the circumstances, and even sent a garrison of their own citizens to Olympium, fearing that the Athenians might lay hands on some of the treasures there, and the rest and return to the city. The Athenians, however, did not go to the temple, but collected their dead and laid them up on a pyre and passed the night upon the field. The next day, they gave the enemy back their dead under a truce, to number about 256 Syracusans and allies, to gather together the bones of their own, some Athenian allies, taken the spoils of the enemy, sailed back to Catana. It was now winter, and it did not seem possible for the moment to carry a war so near Syracuse until cavalrymen had been sent for from Athens and levied among the allies in Sicily. To go away with utter inferiority in cavalry and money having been collected in the country and received from Athens until some of the cities which had hoped would now be more disposed to listen to them after the battle had been brought over and gained necessity providing a campaign for the war against against Syracuse. With the intention of they sailed off for Naxos and Catana for the winter. Meanwhile, the Syracusans burnt their dead and then held an assembly in which Hermocrates, son of Hermon, a man with a general ability of the first order, had given proof of military capacity and courage in war, came forward and encouraged them. He told them not to let what had occurred make them give way, since their spirit had not been conquered, but that want of discipline had done to the mischief. Still, they had not been beaten so much as might have been expected, especially as they were, one might say, novices in the art of war, an army of artisans opposed to the most experienced soldiers of Hellas. What also has done the greatest harm was the number of the generals, there being 15 of them, and the quality of the orders, combined with disorder and the insubordination of troops. But if they were to have a few skillful generals and use this winter in preparing their hoplites, finding arms for such as not as had not got any, so to make them as numerous as possible, and forcing them to attend their training generally, they would have every chance of beating their adversaries. Courage being already theirs, and discipline in the field having been added to it. Indeed, both these qualities would improve, since danger would exercise them in discipline, while their courage would be led to surpass itself in the confidence which skill inspires. The generals should be few and elected with full powers, and an oath should be taken to leave their entire discretion to their command. If they adopted this plan, their secrets would be better kept, and all preparations would be properly made, and there'd be no room for excuses. The Syracusans heard him and voted everything as he advised, and elected three generals: Hermocrates himself, Heraclides, son of Lycomedes, and Sinus, son of Executes. Executes. Secates. They also sent envoys to Corinth and Sparta to procure a force of allies to join them, and induce the Spartans for their sake to address themselves more seriously to the war against the Athenians. They might either have to leave Sicily or be less able to send reinforcements to their army there. The Athenians' force at Cantina, now at once against Messalina, sailed against Messalina in the expectation that it would be betrayed to them. The intrigue, however, came to nothing, for Alcibiades, who had known the secret when he had left his command upon the summons from home, foreseeing that he would be outlawed, gave information about the plot to the friends of the Syracusans in Messalina, who had once put to death its author, and rose in arms with those who supported them against opposing factions, and succeeded in preventing the admissions of the Athenians. The latter waited for 13 days, and then they were exposed to the weather and without provisions, met with no success, went back to Naxos, where they made places for their ships to lie and erected a palisade around the camp and retired into winter quarters. Meanwhile, they sent a tribune to Athens asking for money and cavalrymen to be sent to them in the spring. Meanwhile, during the winter, the Syracusans built a wall into the city as to enclose the statue of Apollo Telementes all along the side facing Epipola, in order to make the task of circumventilation longer and more difficult in case of their being defeated. They also erected a fort at Megria and another at Opilemum, and struck palisades along the sea whenever there was a landing place. Meanwhile, they knew that the Athenians were wintering at Naxos. They marched with all their people to Catana and ravaged the land and set fire to the tents and encampments of the Athenians, so returned home. Learning that the Athenians were sending emissaries to Cantina and the strengths of the alliance had been concluded in the time of Laches in order to gain the city, if possible, they also sent envoys to the Syracusans to oppose them. They had a shrewd suspicion that the Chemonians had not provided the aid they did not send for in the first battle very willingly, and now they feared they would refuse to assist them at all in the future after seeing the success of the Athenians in action, and would join on the ladder of friendship. Hermocrates, with some of the others, accordingly arrived at Chaeronea from Syracuse, and Euphemus and others from the Athenians, an assembly of Chaemoneans having been convinced, uh, Hermocrates spoke as follows, in the hope of prejudicing against the Athenians. Chaeroneians, we did not come on this embassy because we are afraid of your being frightened by actual forces of the Athenians, but rather of you being won over by what they would say to you before you heard anything from us. They have come to Sicily with the pretext that you know, and the attentions which we all suspect, in my opinion, will less to restore the Leontines to their home than to oust us from ours, as it is beyond all reason that they should restore in Sicily the cities they lay waste in Hellenes, or should cherish the Leontinese Chaldeans because of their Ionian blood, and keep in service the Eubinian Chaldeans, whom the Leontines are a colony. No, it is the very same policy which has provided so successful in Hellenes that is now being tried in Sicily. After being chosen as the leader of the Ionians and other allies of the Athenian origins in the struggle to punish the Persians, the Athenians accuse some allies of failure in military service, some of fighting against each other, and others in the case might be upon suspicion pretext that they could be found until they thus subdued them all. In short, the struggle against the Persians, the Athenians did not fight for the liberty of the Hellenes, or Hellenes for their own liberty, but the former to make countrymen serve them instead of him, and rather the latter to change one master for another, wiser indeed than the first, but wiser for evil. But we have not only come, we have not, but we have not now come to declare to audience familiar with them the misdeeds of a city so open in its accusation as the Athenians, but rather to blame ourselves, whom with the warring we possessed in Hellenes, in those parts that have been enslaved through not supposing each other, seeing the same sophism being now tried upon ourselves, such the restorations of the Latine kinfolk in support of the Aegean allies do not stand together, and resolutely show that there are no Ionians and Hellespontines in our islanders who change constantly, but always serve a master, sometimes the Mede, sometimes the other, but free Dorians from the independent Peloponnese dwelling in Sicily. Or are we waiting until we are taken in detail, one city after another, knowing as we do that no other way can be conquered, that we can be conquered, and seeing that they turn to this plan, so to divide some of us by words, draw some by the bait of an alliance, and to open war with each other, and ruin others by such flattery as different circumstances may render acceptable? Do we suppose, with destruction first overtake a distant fellow countryman, that the danger will not come to each of us also, and that he who suffers before us will suffer himself alone? As for the Crimeans who say that this is the Syracusan, not he who is the enemy of the Athenians, and that thinks it's awful to have encountered risk on behalf of my country, I would have him bear in mind that he will fight in my country not more for mine than for his own, and that and will do so more safely than if he entered the struggle not alone after the way had been cleared by my ruin, but with his as but with me as his ally. And the object of the Athenians is not so much to punish the enmity of the Syracusan as to use me as the excuse to secure the friendship of the Camerinian. As for him who envies or even fears us, and envied and feared great powers must always be, and who on this account wishes Syracuse to be humble and taught a lesson, but would still have her survive in the interest of her own security. The wish he indulges is not humanly possible. A man can control his own desire, but he cannot likewise control circumstances. In this event of his calculation proved mistaken, he will live to bewail his own misfortune and wish to be again an envying my prosperity. An idle wish if he now sacrifices us and refuses to take his share of perils, which are the same in reality, though not in name, for him as for us. That is normally the prescription of our power being really his own salvation. It was to be expected that you, of all people in the world, Camerarians, being our immediate neighbor and the next in danger, would have foreseen this, and instead of supporting us in the lukewarm way that you are now doing, would rather have come to us of your own accord and be offering at Syracuse aid, which you would now have asked us for Camarilla, if the Athenians had come first to Camarilla in order to encourage us to resist the invader. Neither you, however, nor the rest have yet bestirred yourselves in this direction. Fear perhaps will make you seek to do the right both to us and to the invader, and plead that you have an alliance with the Athenian. But you have made that alliance not against your friends, but against the enemies that might attack you, and to help the Athenians when they are wronged by others, not when they are wronging their neighbors. Even the Begrians, Caledonians though they be, refuse to help to restore the Caledonian Leontinians, and it would be strange if, while they suspect the truth behind this fine pretense and are wise without reason, you are with every reason on your side, should yet choose to assist your natural enemy, and should join with their direst foes in undoing those whom nature has made your own kinfolk. This is not right. You should help us without fear of their armaments, which has no terrors if we hold together. But if we let them succeed in their endeavor to separate us, indeed, without attacking us by ourselves and being victorious in battles, they would have to go off without accomplishing their purpose. United, therefore, we have no cause to despair, but rather new encouragements to league together, especially as help will come to us from the Peloponnesians, who are in military matters the undoubted superiors of the Athenians. And you need not think that your prudent policy of taking sides with neither, because allies of both, is either safe or for you or for fair to us. Practically, it is not as fair as it pretends to be. If the vanquished be defeated and the victor conquered through your refusing to join, what is the effect of your abstention but to leave the former to perish unaided and to allow the latter to offend unhindered? And yet it were more honorable to join those who are not only the injured party, but your own kindred, and by doing so defend the common interest of Sicily and save your friends, the Athenians, from doing wrong. In conclusion, we Syracusans say that it is useless for us to demonstrate either to you or to the rest what you already know as well as we do, but we entreat and if our entreaty fail, we protest that we are menaced by our external enemies, the Ionians, and are betrayed by you, our fellow Dorians. If the Athenians reduce us, They will own their victory to your decision, but in their own name will reap the honor, and will receive as the prize of the trumpet the very men who enabled them to gain it. On the other hand, if we are the conquerors, you will have to pay for having been the cause of our danger. Therefore, consider therefore, and now make your choice between security at present servitude offers and the prospect of a conquering with us, and thereby escaping disgraceful submission to the Athenian master and avoiding the lasting enmity of Syracuse. And such were the words of Hermocrates, to whom Euphemes at the Athenian ambassador spoke as follows. Now, this is at paragraph 61, 81. The Athenian ambassador spoke as follows. Although we came here only to renew the former alliance, the attack of the Syracuse compels us to speak of our empire and the good right we have to it. The best proof of this the speaker himself furnished, when he called the Ionians eternal enemies of the Dorians. That is true, since the Peloponnesian Dorians are our superior in numbers and their and near neighbors. We Ionians looked out for the best means of escaping their domination. After the Persian War, we had a fleet, so we got rid of the empire and the supremacy of the Spartans, who had no right to give orders to us more than we to them, except that of being the stronger at the moment, and being appointed leaders of the king's former subjects, and continuing to be so, think that we are least likely to fall on the minion of the Peloponnesians if we have sufficient force to defend ourselves. And in succinct truth, having nothing unfair, nothing having done nothing unfair in reducing into submission Aeonians and islanders, and the kinfolk whom the Syracusans say we have enslaved. They are our kinfolk. They came against their mother country, that is to say, against us, together with the Medes. And instead of having the courage to revolt and sacrifice their property as we did when we abandoned our city, chose to be slaves themselves and to try to make us slaves too. We therefore deserve to rule because we've placed the largest fleet and the unflinching patriotism in the service of the Hellenes, and because these our subjects did us harm by their ready subservience to Persians, and quite apart from what we seek to strengthen ourselves against the Peloponnesians. We make no fine professions of having a right to rule because we overthrew the barbarians single handed, or because we risked what we did risk for freedom of the subject in question, any more than that for that, in other words, subject freedom of the subjects in questions, any more than for that of all and for our own. No one can be censured for providing for his own safety. If we are now here in Sicily, it is equally in the interest of our own security, which we perceive that your interests also coincide. We prove this by the conduct of which the Sicilians cast us against us, and which you sometimes too fearfully suspected, knowing that those whom fear has made suspicious may be carried away by the charm of eloquence of the moment, but when they come to act, follow their interests. Now, as we have said, fear makes us hold our empire in Hellenes, and fear makes us come us come now now come with the help of our friends to safely order matters in Sicily and not enslave any, but prevent any from being enslaved. Meanwhile, let no one imagine that none of our business to be interested in you, seeing that you are preserved and are able to hold out against the Syracusan. They will be less likely to harm us by sending troops to the Peloponnesus. Um, in this way, you have everything to do with us. And on this account, it is perfectly reasonable for us to restore the Leotanes and to make them not subjects of their kinmen in Euboea, but as powerful as possible, to help us by causing trouble for the Syracusans from their frontier. In Hellenes, we are alone a match of our enemies. For the assertion that it is beyond all reason that we should free the Sicilian while we enslave the Chaldean, the fact that the latter is useful to us by being without arms and contributed money only, while the former Leontinians and other friends cannot be too independent. Besides, for tyrants and imperial cities, nothing is unreasonable if expedient. No one a kinsman unless sure. But friendship or enmity is everywhere a matter of time and circumstance. Here in Sicily, our interest is not to weaken our friends, but to, by means of their strength, to cripple our enemies. Why doubt this? In Hellenes, we treat our allies as we find them useful, and the Chaldeans and the Metherians govern themselves and furnish ships, while the rest have harder terms to pay money tribute in money, while others, though islanders, would who would rather be easy for us to take, are free altogether because they occupy convenient positions around the Peloponnesus. In our own settlement of of the cities here in Sicily, we should therefore naturally be guided by our interest and by fear, as we say of the Syracusans. Their ambition is to rule you. Their plan is to use the suspicions that we excite to unite you. And then, when we have gone away without effecting anything, to by force or through your isolation, to become masters of Sicily, and masters they must become, if you unite with them, as a force of that magnitude will no longer be easy for us to deal with united, and would be more than a match for you as soon as we were away. Any other view of the case is condemned by the facts. When you first asked us over, the fear which you held out was the danger to Athens if we let you come under the dominions of Syracuse. And that is not right now to mistrust the very same argument by which you claim to convince us, or to give way to suspicion because we have come with a larger force against the power of that city. Those whom you should really distrust are the Syracusans. We are not able to stay here without you, and if we proved perfidious enough to bring you into subjection, we would be unable to keep you in bondage, owing to the length of the voyage and difficulties have guarding large and, in a military sense, mainland cities. The Syracusans live close to you, not in a camp, but in a city greater than the force we have here with us. They plot always against you, never let slip an opportunities once offended. They have shown in the case of the Athenians and others, and now they have the infantry, just as if you were fools, to invite you to aid them against the power that hinders this, and that they and thus they have far and that has thus far maintained independent, Sicily's independence, um, or maintain an independent Sicily. Um, we as uh, 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 we as against them invite you to a much more real safety. When we beg you not to betray that common security that we provide for each other, and to reflect that they, even without allies, will, by their numbers, always have the way open to you, while you will not. often have the opportunity of defending yourselves with such numerous auxiliaries. If, though your suspicions you once let us go away unsuccessful or defeated, you will wish to see us back again, only if only a handful, when the day is past in which our presence could do anything for you, which our presence could do anything for you. But we hope, Camarians, that the comedies of the Syracusans will not be allowed to succeed either with you or with the rest. We have told you the whole truth upon the thing we are suspected of, and now being briefly capitulate in the hope of convincing you. We assert that we are the rulers of the Hellenes in order not to be subjects of liberators of Sicily. Subject liberators in Sicily. We are not in order not to be subjects. Liberators in Sicily, that we may not be harmed by the Sicilians, that we are compelled to interfere in many things because we have many things to guard against, and that now, as before, we have come as allies to those to you who have suffered wrong on this island, not without invitation, but upon invitation. Accordingly, instead of making yourself judges or censors of our conduct, and trying to turn us, which it were now difficult to do, so far as there is anything in our interfering policy or in our character that accords with your interest, take this and make use of it, and be sure that far from being injurious to all alike, to the most of the Hellenists, that policy is also even beneficial. But think of it: all men in all places, wherever, even when we are not, who either fear or plan aggression, from the near prospects before them. In the one case, obtaining our intervention in their favor, and the other, in our arrival, making the venture dangerous, find themselves constrained, respectively, to be moderate against their will, and to be preserved without the effort of their own. Do you reject this security that is open to all who desire it, and now it is now offered to you? But do like others, and instead of being always on the defensive against the Syracusans, unite with us, and in your turn at last, and in your turn at last threaten them. Such were the word of Euphemides. What the Chaldeans felt was what the Chemadians felt was this: they sympathized with the Athenians, except insofar as they might be afraid of their subjecting Sicily, and they had always been enmity with their neighbor Syracuse. The very fact, however, from that very fact, however, they were their neighbors, and they feared the Syracusans most of the two, being apprehensive that the Syracusans might win without their help, both sent them to, in the first instance, the few horsemen mentioned, and for the future determined to support them in most fact, although as sparing as possible. But for the moment, in order not to seem to slight the Athenians, especially as they had been successful in the engagement, and to answer both alike. In accordance with the resolution, they answered as both that as both the contending parties happened to be their allies, they thought it would be most consistent with their oath at the present to side with neither, with which answer the ambassadors of each party departed. In the meanwhile, the Syracusan persuade her preparations of war. The Athenians were encamped at Naxos and tried by negotiation to gain as many Sicilies as possible. Those more in the lowland and subject to Syracuse mostly held aloof, but the peoples of the interior, who had never been otherwise than independent, with few exceptions, at once joined the Athenians, and brought down grain to the army, and some even money. And the Athenians marched against those who refused to join, and forced them to do so, and in case of others, they were stopped by the Syracusans sending garrisons and reinforcement. Meanwhile, the Athenians moved in the winter quarters from Naxos to Cantina, and reconstruct the camp burnt by the Syracusans, and stayed where the rest of the winter. They also sent a Trimene to Carthage with offers of friendship. In other words, on a chance of obtaining assistance, and another to Termea, some of the cities there having spontaneously offered to join them in the war. I think that they also sent, I think the Syracusans here. With offer the Frenchmen chance at abstaining assistance, and others, the Tyrians, some of the cities having supported, offered to join them in the war. They also sent round to the Sicils and Aegeus, desiring them to send as many as horse as possible, while preparing bricks and iron and all the other things necessary for circumventilations, including by the spring to begin the hostilities. So that's weird that they're saying to Carthage. Oh, okay, Carthage. Okay, not Carthage. Sorry, I'm sorry, I'm wrong here. They're talking about the Athenians. Carthage is the island in the south. They sent a tribune to Carthage and other offers of friendship. Not Carthage, not Corinth. Okay, that's different. And so they started preparing for the um, 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 in the meantime, the Syracusans' envoy that had been dispatched to Corinth and Sparta's had tried, they passed along the coast to persuade the Italians to interfere with the proceedings of the Athenians, which they argued threatened Italy quite as much as Syracuse, and having arrived at Corinth, made a speech calling on the Corinthians to assist them on the grounds of their common origins. The Corinthians voted at once to aid them unhesitatingly themselves, and to send envoys with them to Sparta, to help them persuade her to prosecute the war with the Athenians more openly at home and send assistance to Sicily. The envoys from Corinth, having received Sparta, found Alcibiades there. Having reached Sparta, having found Alcibiades there with his fellow refugees, who had without delay crossed over in a trading vessel from Thurii, first at the Cluny and Elis, and afterwards there to Sparta, upon the Spartans' own invitation, after first obtaining a safe conduct, as he feared them for the part he had taken in the affairs of the Mantia. The result was that the Corinthians, Syracusans, and Alcibiades, all pressing the same request, the assembly of the Spartans succeeded in persuading them, but as the ephors and the authorities although resolved to send envoys to Syracuse to prevent them surrendering to the Athenians, showed no inclination to send any assistance. Alcibiades now came forward, inflamed and stirred the Spartans by speaking the follows. Alcibiades and Sparta. Um, I am forced to speak to you of the prejudice with which I regard, in order to that suspicion may not make you disinclined to listen to me upon public matters. The connection with you as your proxima, which the ancestors of our family, by reason of some discontent, renounced. I personally tried to renew my good offices towards you, and particularly on the occasion at the disaster of Pylos. But although I maintained this friendly attitude, you chose to negotiate the peace with the Athenians through my enemies, and thus to strengthen them and discredit me. You therefore had no right to complain if I turn to the Maniturians and Argives and seize other occasions of thwarting or injuring you. And the time has now come when those among you who are in bitterness of the moment may have been then unfairly angry at me. You should look at the matter in its true light and take a different view. Those again who judge me unfavorably because I leaned rather onto the side of the people, must not think that their dislike is any better founded. We have always been hostile to tyrants, and all who oppose the arbitrary power are called the people. Hence, we continued to act as leaders of the multitude, beside which a democracy was the government of the city, and was necessary the most things to conform to establish conditions. However, we endeavored to be more moderate than the licentious temper of the times, and while they were others, formerly as now, who tried to lead the multitude astray, the same who banished me. Our party was that of the whole people, our creed being to do our part in preserving the form of government under which the city enjoyed the most greatness and freedom, and which we had found existing. As for democracy, these men of sense among us knew that it was as and perhaps okay from men of sense among us knew what it was, and I perhaps as well as I have more cause to complain of it. But there is nothing new to be said of our patent absurdity. Meanwhile, we did not think it safe to alter it under the pressures to your hostility. So much then for the prejudice which I am regarding. Now I can call your attention to the question we much consider, and upon which superior knowledge perhaps permits me to speak. We sailed to Sicily first to conquer, if not possible, Sicilians, and then and after them the Italians also, and finally to assail the empire and the city of Carthage. Even in the event of all or most of these schemes succeeding, we were then to attack the Peloponnesians, bringing with us the entire force of the Hellenes acquired in these parts, and taking numbers of barbarians into our pay, as such as the Iberians and the others from those countries, recognized as the most warlike, and building numerous triremes in addition to those which we already had already, number being plentiful in Italy, and with this fleet blockading the Peloponnese from sea and assailing it with our armies by land, taking some of the cities by storm and besieging others. We hope without difficulty to defeat them completely. After this, to rule the whole of Hellenic world. Money and grain for the better execution of these plans were to be supplied in sufficient quantities by the newly acquired places in these countries, independent of our revenues at home. Um, you have heard the history of the present expedition from the man who most exactly knows what the intentions were, and the remaining generals will, if they can, carry these out the same. But that the cities in Syracuse must succumb if you do not help them. I will now show. Though the Sicilians, with all their experience, might even now be saved if their forces were united, and the Syracusans alone, beaten already in one battle with all their people and blocked by the sea, will be unable to withstand the Athenian armament that is now there. But if Syracuse falls, all of Sicily falls also, and Italy immediately afterwards. The danger which I now spoke of is that quarter will before before long be upon you. None, none needs therefore imagine that only Sicily is in question. The Peloponnesian will also, unless you speedily do as I tell you, and send on board ships to Syracuse troops that will be able to row their ships themselves and to serve as hoplites the moment they land. And I consider even more important than ships a Spartite commanding officer to discipline the forces already on foot and to compel shirkers to serve. The friends that you have already will thus be more confident, and the waverers will be encouraged to join you. Meanwhile, you must carry on the war here more openly, so that the Syracusans, seeing that you do not forget them, may put heart into their resistance, and that the Athenians may be less able to reinforce their armaments. You must fortify Delea and Attica, the blow of which the Athenians are always most afraid, and the only one they will think they have not experienced at the present war. The most surest method of harming an enemy being is to find out what he most fears, and to choose the means of attacking him, since everyone naturally knows best his own weak points and fears accordingly. The fortification in question, while it benefits you, will create difficulties for your adversaries, of which I shall pass over many, and shall name only mention the chief. Whatever property there was in the country will most of it become yours, either by capture or by surrender. And the Athenians will at once be deprived of their revenues from silver mines at Lycarum, of which present gains from their land, which their present grain from land their lands and from the law courts, and above all the revenues from their allies, which will be paid less regularly if they lose their all of Athens. And seeing you addressing yourselves with vigor to this war, the zeal and speed uh, um, with which this all is done depends, Sparta, upon yourselves as if possible. I'm quite confident. I have little fear of being mistaken. Meanwhile, I hope that none of you will think any worse of me for in having hitherto passed as a lover of my country, now actively join its worst enemies in attacking it, or will suspect that I say as the fruit of an outlaw enthusiasm. I am an outlaw from this inequity of those who drove me forth, not if you will be not if you will be guided by me from your service. My worst enemies are not you who openly harmed your foes, but they who forced their friends to become enemies. And love of country is what I do not feel when I am wrong, but when I feel, but what I feel when secure in my rights as a citizen. I indeed I do not consider that I am attacking a country that is still mine. I am rather trying to recover the one that is no longer mine, that is mine no longer. And a true lover of his country is not he who consents to lose it unjustly rather than attack it, but he who longs for it as much that he will go to all lengths to recover it. For myself, therefore, Spartans, I beg you to use me without scruple of danger and trouble of any kind, and to remember the argument in everyone's mouth that if I did you great harm as an enemy, I could likewise do you great service as a friend, insomuch as I know the plans of the Athenians. While I only guessed yours, while I only guessed yours. For yourself, I entreat you to believe that your most vital interests are now under consideration. I urge you to send without hesitation the expedition to Sicily and Attica, by the presence of a small part of your forces. Will you save important cities in that island, and you will destroy the power of Athens, both present and prospective. After this, you will dwell in security and enjoy the supremacy of all Hellenists, resting not on force, but upon consent and affection. Such were the words of Alcibiades. The Spartans, who had perceivedly intended to march against Athens themselves, but were still waiting and looking about them, at once became much more serious when they received this particular information from Alcibiades, and considered that they had heard it from the man who knew best the truth of the matter. Accordingly, they now turned their attentions to fortifying Delia and sending immediate aid to the Sicilians, naming Gylippus, son of Cleidrasius, the command of the Syracusans, instructed him to consult with that people and with the Corinthians, and to arrange for help to reach the island in the best and speediest possible under the circumstances. Gylippus requested that the Corinthians send him at once two ships from Asinine, and to prepare the rest that they intended to send, and have them ready to sail in the proper time. Having settled this, the envoys departed from Sparta. Meanwhile, in Athens, the Tribune from Sicily sent the generals for money, and a cavalry arrived at Athens. And the Athenians, after hearing what they wanted, voted to send the supplies and the armaments and the cavalry. And the winter ended, and with it ended the 17th year of the present war of Thucydides, is the historian. Okay, so this is ending the winter, and this ends the winter. I'm going to stop here. I think that is a good place to stop. If you have any questions or comments, please put them below. I will answer them when I see them. If you like this, like it, share it with a friend. If you didn't like it, you can say thumbs down. You can even put your criticisms in the Facebook, in the discussion area, comment section. If you want to subscribe and get more of this thing, subscribe. Also, even if you want to follow me on social media, you can follow me on social media, the different places below. If you want to help and contribute something through Patreon or through Subscribestar, heck, you can even do this by buying the textbook that I do, notebook for Aristotle's Politics, but by Lulu itself. That would be good. That'd be nice if you don't want to join the Subscribestar. That's it. I will say, wish you all have a good day, and I'll see you soon next time. Okay, bye bye.